On March 17, 1992, 2:47 p.m., Viktor Petrov pushed through the automatic doors of the Food Lion on Falls of News Road, and the refrigerated air hit him like a wave. The store smelled like floor wax and rotisserie chicken. Muzak played overhead, something soft and forgettable, the kind of music designed to make you buy more cereal. He wore a teal windbreaker over a white polo shirt, acid-washed jeans bunched at the ankles, and white Reeboks that squeaked against the linoleum. He looked like every other man in Raleigh that spring, unremarkable, suburban, safe. He picked up a red plastic basket near the entrance. Outside, in a Dodge Caravan parked 3 rows back, FBI agent Mark Reynolds adjusted his binoculars. He watched Viktor through the plate glass windows, watched him move past the produce section without looking at the tomatoes, watched him turn left toward the cereal aisle with the purposeful gait of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Reynolds spoke into his radio. His voice was flat, emotionless. He'd been watching Viktor Petrov for 11 months. 11 months of grocery stores and gas stations and community centers. 11 months of waiting for this exact moment. Viktor moved through the aisles slowly. He picked up a box of Cheerios, put it in his basket, picked up a jar of Jif peanut butter, put it down, picked up Skippy instead. Every movement was calibrated, measured. He was shopping the way normal people shop, distracted, inefficient, human. He paused at the end of the bread aisle and studied the Wonder Bread labels as if the decision between white and wheat was the most important thing in his world. It wasn't. The store was busy for a Tuesday afternoon. Young mothers pushed carts with toddlers strapped in the front seats. An elderly man in a Vietnam veteran cap studied the coffee selection. A teenage clerk stocked shelves near the dairy section, his movements mechanical and bored. Nobody looked at Viktor. Nobody ever looked at Viktor. That was the point. He'd been living in Raleigh for 6 years. 6 years in a ranch-style house on Leesville Road with vinyl siding the color of weak tea and a postage stamp lawn. He mowed every Saturday morning at 9 o'clock. 6 years of waving to neighbors, of taking out the trash on Wednesday nights, of driving a 1988 Honda Accord with a faded bumper sticker peeling off the rear fender. 6 years of building a life so crushingly normal that nobody would ever suspect what he really was. A spy for the Soviet Union. Except the Soviet Union didn't exist anymore. It had collapsed 4 months earlier, dissolved into 15 separate republics and a chaos of economic ruin. The red flag had come down from the Kremlin. The Berlin Wall was already rubble. And Viktor Petrov was still here, in Raleigh, North Carolina, pretending to care about peanut butter brands while his entire world crumbled 6,000 miles away. But the work wasn't finished. There were still secrets to be passed, still handlers who needed information, still one final package waiting for him behind a paper towel dispenser in the men's restroom. Reynolds knew this because they'd been listening to Viktor's phone calls for 3 months. They'd been reading his mail. They'd been following him to the Harris Teeter and the Eckerd drugs and the Blockbuster video. They knew about the Jazzercise class. Every Tuesday and Thursday at 6:30 p.m., Viktor Petrov walked into the Raleigh Community Center on Millbrook Road and spent 45 minutes doing grapevines and box steps to Gloria Estefan and Paula Abdul. He wore gray sweatpants and a Carolina blue tank top. He smiled at the women in their neon leotards. He asked about their kids. He complimented their form. He was enthusiastic but not too enthusiastic, committed but not obsessive. He missed class once in 6 years, when he had the flu, and he called ahead to let the instructor know. The FBI initially dismissed it as a coincidence. A man trying to stay fit, a lonely bachelor looking for social connections. But the more they watched, the more they understood. The Jazzercise class wasn't about fitness. It was camouflage. It was the most brilliant piece of social engineering they'd ever seen. Because who suspects a Soviet spy of doing Jazzercise? Who looks at a middle-aged man in sweatpants doing step touches to rhythm-driven pop music and thinks, that man is stealing defense secrets from the Research Triangle Park? Nobody. That was the genius of it. Viktor Petrov had understood something essential about American suburban life. The people who participate are invisible. The people who show up to community events, who join neighborhood watch groups, who attend Jazzercise classes and PTA meetings and church potlucks. Those people are trusted. They're part of the fabric. They're safe. So Viktor became part of the fabric. He learned the names of everyone in his class. He remembered birthdays. He brought cookies to the Christmas party, snickerdoodles, homemade, wrapped in red cellophane. He asked Sharon about her daughter's college applications. He consoled Debbie when her husband left her. He was present. He was nice. He was exactly the kind of person you'd trust to water your plants while you were on vacation. And that trust gave him cover to do his real work. The house on Leesville Road was perfect for it. Single story. Detached garage, privacy fence around the backyard, no close neighbors. He'd chosen it carefully in 1986, back when the Soviet Union still had money to fund deep cover operations in American cities. Raleigh was ideal, close to Research Triangle Park, where IBM and Burroughs Wellcome and dozens of defense contractors worked on computing and biotechnology and materials science. Close to Fort Bragg, close to the Pentagon's research pipelines, far enough from Washington to avoid the concentrated counterintelligence presence, but connected enough to matter. Viktor worked as a software consultant. Freelance, flexible hours. He did real work. He had real clients, real projects, real income, because the cover had to be authentic. But the consulting work gave him access. It let him ask questions. It let him attend conferences, network with engineers, collect technical papers and software documentation that would have been restricted in Moscow but were freely available at IEEE symposiums in Durham. He passed information slowly, carefully. Never enough to raise alarms. A technical paper here. A photograph of a circuit board there. Names of engineers working on classified projects. Details about government contracts. The kind of intelligence that seemed insignificant in isolation, but could be assembled into something valuable by analysts at the GRU. He used dead drops, never the same location twice. A hollowed-out tree at Shelley Lake. A magnetic key box under a park bench at Pullen Park. A waterproof container buried near the 8th hole at Lockmere Golf Club. His handler, a cultural attaché at the Soviet embassy in Washington who officially didn't exist anymore, would retrieve the packages and replace them with new instructions. Until December 1991, when everything changed. The Soviet Union collapsed. The embassy staff went home, the handler disappeared, and Viktor Petrov was alone. He considered running. Considered disappearing into the Midwest, changing his name again, starting over. But running meant abandoning 6 years of work. Running meant letting the Americans win. And somewhere in Moscow, in whatever remained of the intelligence apparatus, someone was still counting on him. So he stayed. He kept going to Jazzercise, kept mowing his lawn, kept shopping at Food Lion, and he waited for final instructions. They came 3 days ago. A classified ad in the News and Observer. 1988 Schwinn bicycle, excellent condition, $75. That was the code. The final drop was ready. Location? Food Lion on Falls of Noose Road. Men's restroom, behind the paper towel dispenser. Time window, Tuesday afternoon between 2 and 4 p.m. This was it, the last package. Whatever was behind that dispenser contained the final intelligence he'd been tasked to retrieve. Probably documents, possibly a microdot, maybe a disk with encrypted files. He didn't know what it was. He didn't need to know. His job was to retrieve it and deliver it to the backup protocol. A post office box in Richmond registered to a shell company that would forward it to an address in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, where former KGB officers were quietly reassembling their networks in exile. One last job. Then he could disappear. Viktor moved toward the back of the store. He passed the deli counter where a worker in a paper hat sliced ham, past the dairy section with its rows of milk jugs and orange juice cartons. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. that distinctive electric hum that every American grocery store shared. His windbreaker crinkled as he walked. The fabric was cheap, synthetic, the kind of thing you bought at discount stores for $20. He'd bought 3 of them in different colors: teal, purple, forest green, the uniform of suburban anonymity. The restroom was in the back corner past the dairy section, near the swinging doors that led to the stockroom. A white placard with a black silhouette of a man marked the entrance. Viktor glanced around casually. Nobody was watching. Nobody cared. He pushed through the door. The bathroom smelled like industrial soap and bleach. 2 urinals on the left wall, 2 stalls on the right, a sink with a soap dispenser that dripped pink liquid onto the porcelain, and on the back wall, between the sink and the hand dryer, a white metal paper towel dispenser. Viktor walked to the sink, turned on the water, washed his hands slowly, methodically, giving himself time to confirm he was alone. The water was cold. It ran over his knuckles, his wrists. He watched it swirl down the drain. The door to the restroom opened. Viktor didn't look up, kept washing his hands. A man entered, middle-aged, balding, wearing a golf shirt and khakis. The man walked to the urinal, unzipped, and started to relieve himself. The sound echoed off the tile walls. Viktor dried his hands under the air dryer. The machine roared to life, blasting hot air that smelled faintly like burned dust. He stood there for the required 30 seconds, hands under the nozzle, watching the man at the urinal in his peripheral vision. The man finished, zipped up, walked to the sink, washed his hands, dried them with a paper towel from the dispenser. Viktor waited. The man left. Silence. Viktor moved quickly now. He walked to the paper towel dispenser and gripped the sides. The metal was cold against his palms. He pulled. The dispenser was bolted to the wall, but there was a gap, a 2-inch space between the back of the unit and the tile. He reached into the gap, fingers searching. There. His fingertips touched plastic. He pulled it free. A clear Ziploc bag, sealed tight, containing a single 3.5-inch floppy disk. Black plastic. No label. 1,200 kilobytes of data. Whatever was on that disk represented the endpoint of a 6-year operation. Viktor slipped it into the inner pocket of his windbreaker. The disk was thin, light. It barely made a bulge. He walked back to the sink, washed his hands again, this time for real, to remove any dust or residue from the dead drop. He studied his reflection in the mirror, brown hair going gray at the temples, crow's feet around his eyes, a face that belonged to a man named Viktor Petrov, who'd been born in Minsk in 1949, who'd studied electrical engineering at Moscow State University, who'd been recruited by the GRU in 1972, who'd spent 2 years training at the Red Banner Institute before being inserted into the United States in 1981 with a Canadian passport and a completely fabricated background. Except that wasn't true anymore. That man, that identity, was about to cease to exist. Viktor turned off the water, dried his hands on his jeans. The disk pressed against his ribs like a second heartbeat. He pushed open the bathroom door. Mark Reynolds was standing in the aisle, 6 feet tall, crew cut, navy blue windbreaker with yellow letters across the back, FBI. He wasn't alone. 3 other agents flanked him, 2 men, 1 woman, all wearing the same jackets, all with their hands resting casually near their hips, where their service weapons were holstered. The store had gone quiet. The muzak had been turned off. The customers had been cleared out. The teenage stock clerk was gone. The deli worker was gone. It was just Viktor and the FBI and the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Reynolds didn't smile. His expression was neutral, professional, the face of someone who'd practiced this moment many times. Viktor didn't move. His hand was still on the bathroom door, holding it half open. His mind was racing, calculating. The nearest exit was 30 feet behind him, through the stockroom. The front entrance was 40 feet to his right, past the checkout lanes. Both routes were blocked. There were probably more agents outside, probably a perimeter around the entire building. He'd been burned. Reynolds took a step forward. The movement was slow, deliberate. The other agents shifted their positions slightly, creating a semicircle that blocked all possible escape routes. Viktor could see the tactical precision in their formation. They'd done this before. They knew how people react when cornered. They were ready for him to run, to fight, to resist. But Viktor didn't run. He didn't fight. He simply stood there, hands still on the door, the disc pressing against his ribs, his breathing steady and controlled. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The refrigeration units hummed. Somewhere in the distance, a delivery truck beeped as it backed up to the loading dock. Reynolds reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a leather wallet, flipped it open to reveal his credentials. The gold badge caught the overhead light. The identification card had his photograph, his name, his title, Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation. He held it up for Viktor to see. Let him read it. Let the reality of the situation sink in. Then Reynolds lowered the wallet, returned it to his pocket. When he spoke, his voice was calm, conversational, the tone of someone discussing the weather rather than ending a 6-year intelligence operation. The words came out clear and final. Viktor Petrov, or whoever you are, come with us. Viktor took a breath, raised his hands slowly, placed them on top of his head, interlaced his fingers. The perfection of his routine had been his undoing. The Jazzercise classes that never varied. The lawn mowing that happened every Saturday at exactly 9 o'clock. The grocery shopping trips that followed the same route through the same aisles. Real people were messy. Real people forgot things, changed plans, made mistakes. Real people skipped classes when they were tired, let their lawns grow an extra week, bought the wrong brand of peanut butter. Viktor Petrov had never made those mistakes. And that flawless consistency, that mathematical precision in his suburban camouflage, had marked him as something other than what he pretended to be. One of the agents moved behind him, pulled his arms down, snapped handcuffs around his wrists. The metal was cold and tight. The agent patted him down efficiently, professionally, finding the disc in his windbreaker pocket within seconds. Reynolds held up the Ziploc bag, examining the disc in the fluorescent light. He didn't say anything. Didn't need to. The disc was evidence. Proof. The final piece in an 11-month investigation. They walked Viktor through the stockroom, past pallets of canned goods and cardboard boxes stacked to the ceiling, past the time clock where employees punched in for their shifts, past the break room with its vending machines and folding chairs. The back door opened onto a loading dock where 2 black Suburbans were waiting, engines running. The afternoon sun was bright after the fluorescent gloom of the store. Viktor squinted against it. The parking lot stretched out before him, empty now, cleared by the FBI. In the distance he could see Falls of Noose Road, cars passing by obliviously, people going about their normal Tuesday afternoon routines, picking up kids from school, running errands, living their lives. He wondered if anyone in his Jazzercise class would notice he was gone. If Sharon would wonder why he missed Thursday's session. If Debbie would ask about him. If anyone would remember the quiet man in the gray sweatpants who always smiled and never complained and brought snickerdoodles to the Christmas party. Probably not. That was the thing about being perfectly invisible. When you disappeared, nobody noticed the absence. They put him in the back of the first Suburban. Reynolds climbed in beside him. The door closed with a heavy thunk. The vehicle pulled away from the loading dock, turned right onto Falls of Noose Road, headed north toward the FBI field office in downtown Raleigh. Viktor watched the city pass by through the tinted windows, the shopping centers and office parks, the ranch houses with their tidy lawns, the community centers where people gathered to exercise and socialize and build the connections that made them feel less alone. All of it so familiar now, after 6 years. All of it home, in a way that Moscow had never been. Reynolds was still holding the Ziploc bag with the disc. He turned it over in his hands, studying it from different angles, as if he could divine its contents through the plastic and black casing. The Suburban merged onto Interstate 440. Traffic was light. They'd be downtown in 15 minutes. Then the real work would begin. The interrogation, the debriefing, the slow, methodical process of unraveling 6 years of intelligence operations. Victor thought about the house on Leesville Road, about the lawn he'd mowed every Saturday, about the neighbors he'd waved to, about Sharon and Debbie and all the women in the Jazzercise class who'd treated him like a friend. He thought about the handler in Washington who'd probably escaped back to Moscow when the embassy closed, about the analysts who would have processed his intelligence reports, about the chain of command that had sent him here, to Raleigh, to steal secrets from grocery store bathrooms. He thought about the disc that Reynolds was holding, about whatever it contained, about whether it had been worth it. And he realized he didn't know the answer. Maybe the work mattered regardless of whether the country that had ordered it still existed. Maybe commitment meant something even when the cause was lost. Maybe doing the job, finishing the mission, retrieving that final package from behind the paper towel dispenser, maybe that meant something. Or maybe it was all meaningless. Maybe he'd wasted 6 years of his life doing grapevines and step touches and pretending to care about lawn care. Maybe the disc contained information that nobody wanted anymore. Secrets from a dead empire that had no value in the New World Order. He didn't know. What he did know was this. He'd spent 6 years building a cover identity so perfect that nobody had suspected him until the FBI decided to look closely. He'd gone to Jazzercise twice a week for 6 years. He'd learned the steps, learned the music, learned how to smile and ask about people's kids and bring cookies to parties. He'd become the kind of person who belonged in suburban Raleigh, who fit seamlessly into the fabric of American life. And in the process, he'd lost track of who Viktor Petrov really was. Maybe that was the real cost of deep cover work. Not the risk of capture, not the isolation, but the slow erosion of your original identity until you couldn't remember which version of yourself was real anymore. The Suburban exited the highway. They were downtown now, navigating the grid of one-way streets that characterized the center of Raleigh. Office buildings rose on either side. People walked on sidewalks carrying briefcases and coffee cups, heading home at the end of their workday. Reynolds shifted in his seat, looked at Victor directly for the first time since they'd left the Food Lion. His expression was unreadable, not angry, not triumphant, just tired. The look of someone who'd spent 11 months watching a man buy groceries and go to exercise classes, waiting for one moment of confirmation that would justify all that time and effort. The Suburban pulled into an underground parking garage beneath a nondescript office building. The driver used a key card to open a security gate. They descended 2 levels into darkness, then pulled into a reserved parking space near an elevator bank. Reynolds opened the door. The fluorescent lights in the garage were harsh, casting sharp shadows across the concrete floor. They walked Victor to the elevator, rode it up to the 3rd floor. The doors opened onto a hallway with gray carpet and fluorescent lights and doors marked with numbers instead of names. They took him to interview room 3, a small square space with a metal table, 4 chairs, a mirror that was obviously one-way glass. Reynolds removed the handcuffs. Victor sat. The chair was cold metal, uncomfortable by design. Reynolds sat across from him, placed the Ziploc bag on the table between them. The room was silent except for the hum of the ventilation system. Victor rubbed his wrists where the handcuffs had been. The skin was red but not broken. He looked at the bag, at the black plastic disc that contained whatever secrets his handlers had considered important enough to risk a final dead drop. He'd never know what was on it. That wasn't how it worked. The intelligence would be analyzed by people he'd never meet, processed through channels he'd never see, used for purposes he'd never understand. His job had been to retrieve it. Nothing more. And he'd done his job. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, waited. Outside the small window in the interview room, the sun was beginning to set. Tuesday, March 17, 1992, was ending. Tomorrow would be Wednesday. trash day on Leesville Road. Except Victor wouldn't be there to take out his trash. Someone else would have to do it. Or maybe nobody would. Maybe the trash would pile up in the garage week after week until someone noticed that the quiet man who lived there hadn't been seen in a while. Maybe Sharon would notice he wasn't at Jazzercise on Thursday. Maybe she'd ask the instructor if anyone had heard from him. Maybe someone would call his house, leave a message on his answering machine. Maybe they'd worry, just a little, about the quiet man who never missed class. Or maybe they wouldn't notice at all. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. Viktor Petrov's cover was blown. His mission was complete. His war was over. He looked at Reynolds. At the agent who'd spent 11 months of his life watching a spy do jazzercise. At the man who'd recognized that perfection was its own kind of flaw. Reynolds stared back. Neither man spoke. The ventilation hummed. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The building settled around them with small creaks and groans. And Viktor Petrov sat in interview room 3, under the harsh lights, with the black disk on the table between them, thinking about grapevines and step touches, and the smell of floor wax in a grocery store on Falls of Newsy Road. Thinking about 6 years of pretending to be someone he wasn't. Thinking about how the routine that had protected him had ultimately betrayed him. Thinking about the house on Leesville Road that he'd never see again. The lawn he'd never mow. The jazzercise class he'd never attend. Thinking about Sharon and Debbie and all the people who'd believed he was just a nice man with no secrets, no past, no purpose beyond being their friend. The door opened. A different agent entered, younger, female, carrying a folder. She set it on the table, opened it. Inside were photographs, surveillance photos. Victor at the Food Lion, Victor at his house, Victor at the community center in his gray sweatpants and Carolina blue tank top, mid-grapevine, frozen in time. The evidence of his perfection, the documentation of his flaw. Reynolds picked up one of the photographs, studied it, set it back down. The room was silent. Victor closed his eyes, listened to the fluorescent lights buzz, listened to the ventilation hum, listened to the sound of his own breathing, steady and controlled. The breathing of a man who'd been trained to stay calm under pressure. He thought about the disc, about whatever information it contained, about whether anyone would ever care. He thought about Moscow, about the GRU headquarters where he'd been trained, about the instructors who'd taught him tradecraft and surveillance detection and how to build a cover identity that would withstand scrutiny. They'd taught him well, too well, because the cover had been so perfect that it had become suspicious. The routine had been so flawless that it had marked him as someone who was trying too hard. The normalcy had been so consistent that it had become abnormal. And Mark Reynolds had noticed. That was the thing about intelligence work. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being good enough. Good enough to blend in. Good enough to avoid suspicion. But not so good that the absence of flaws became a flaw itself. Victor had crossed that line. He'd optimized his cover to the point where it no longer looked natural, and that optimization had destroyed him. The female agent left the room, returned with a cup of water in a paper cone, set it on the table in front of Victor. He picked it up, drank. The water was lukewarm and tasted faintly of chlorine. Reynolds was still watching him, still waiting. Victor set down the cup, looked at the mirror, knew there were other agents behind it, watching, recording, documenting every moment of his capture and processing. He wondered what they saw when they looked at him. A spy? A criminal? A relic of a dead empire? Or just a man in a teal windbreaker and acid-washed jeans who'd made the mistake of being too perfect? Outside, the sun had fully set. Night was falling over Raleigh. The office workers had gone home. The restaurants were filling up with dinner crowds. The community center on Millbrook Road was preparing for evening classes. At 6:30, the jazzercise instructor would turn on the music. Gloria Estefan would play through the speakers. The women in their neon leotards would assemble in their usual spots. And there would be an empty space where Viktor Petrov usually stood. Sharon would notice. She'd look at that empty space and wonder where he was. Maybe she'd ask around. Maybe someone would have heard something. Maybe the news would break tomorrow and she'd see his photograph on television and recognize the quiet man who'd smiled at her twice a week for 6 years. Maybe she'd feel betrayed. Maybe she'd feel foolish. Maybe she'd feel nothing at all. Viktor would never know. His life as Viktor Petrov was over. Whatever came next, prison, cooperation, deportation, would belong to someone else. Some other version of himself. Some identity he hadn't yet assumed. Reynolds finally spoke. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. The words didn't matter. Viktor didn't hear them. He was thinking about the disc. About the secrets it contained. About whether they'd been worth 6 years of Jazzercise. About whether anything was worth that. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The ventilation hummed. And Viktor Petrov sat in interview room 3, hands folded on the metal table, waiting for whatever came next. Waiting for the consequences of perfection. Waiting for the end.